Good afternoon, or good morning if you're on the West Coast. Welcome to Remaking the Economy, a policy vision from the Movement for Black Lives. I am Steve Dubb, Senior Editor of Economic Justice here at Nonprofit Quarterly, coming to you from Boston on land historically stewarded by the Massachusetts Nation. For this webinar, co-sponsored by M4BL, we'll hear from many of the authors who contributed to our recent article series on the Vision for Black Lives, an economic policy agenda. Our panelists are Temi F. Bennett is co-CEO of IF, a foundation of radical possibility based in Washington, D.C. Amara Enyia is Director for Policy and Research at the Movement for Black Lives based in Chicago. Rosemary Ndubuizu is Assistant Professor of African American Studies at Georgetown University and a volunteer organizer for One DC based in Washington, D.C. Rahel Teka is Director of Strategic Communications at the Participatory Budgeting Project, based in New York City. And last but not least, Richard Wallace is Founder and Executive Director of Equity and Transformation, also known as EAT, based in Chicago. A few notes. First, we're very excited to take your questions. Please enter your questions into the question box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll share as many of them as I can. Of course, you're also welcome to participate in the chat, as many of you are doing. Thanks. Second, we will share the slides and recording after the webinar, so please don't ask, will I get the slides and recording? You will. Usually they go out by Monday. One last thing, the webinar is free, but producing it is not. So if you like what we are doing and can afford to support NPQ's racial and economic justice work, please consider donating to NPQ today. We also encourage you to join the conversation via social media with our hashtag #RebuildTheEconomy. Thanks for joining us, and please complete the brief survey that will be at after the webinar to inform our future work. And with that, we'll get started with Rosemary, if you could introduce yourself and talk about how you got involved in housing justice work.
Good day, everyone, or good morning if you are on the West Coast. My apologies. I don't know my messaging. So I am with an organization called Organizing Neighborhood Equity, One DC. And we're based in Washington, D.C. But before I do that, I want to say thank you to the conveners, the planners, and all of you all who decided to join us today and participate and listen. So my story in terms of how I became a housing organizer is a little bit accidental. When I was in college, I had my I had my realization when I was a junior in college that I wanted to be a part of the SNCC movement. I wanted to be a part of the Black Liberation Movement. And SNCC really motivated me, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a civil rights organization in the 1960s. And I wanted to be a part of that after I graduated. But when I graduated from college, there wasn't a Black Liberation Movement that was active at the time. They were just nonprofits. So I decided to be a part of a movement nonprofit that I thought most aligned and continued the legacy of SNCC, which was One DC. And I started to volunteer with them. And then eventually they came back and they said, hey, you want a job? And I said, of course, I want my wage work to be in movement work. And so they told me that affordable housing organizer was what they had. And that's when I dove in deep. And that was around 2007. And since then, I've worn many hats at One DC, just recently stepping down from the shared leadership team, our governance body. And now I just am a volunteer movement or member organizer working with one tenant building where we're trying to support the tenants and exercising a unique law, which is called Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which every tenant in DC, for the most part, there are many exceptions, but for the most part, if you live in a multifamily rental community, if your owner decides to sell the property, the tenants have the first right to refuse, which means that they get the chance to potentially buy the property or assign their rights to another landlord. And so we're supporting the tenants now in exercising that right because we want long-term permanent affordable housing in the city. And so that's my story in terms of how I got involved. And I continue to do that work in my wage job now as an assistant professor at Georgetown.
Thanks so much, Rosemary. Rahel, could you introduce yourself and talk briefly about the Participatory Budgeting Project?
Absolutely. My name is Rahel Teka. I, she, her, they, them pronouns. I get to be the communications director at the Participatory Budgeting Project, which means I get to tell the stories of how communities are taking control of the decisions that impact their lives. Participatory budgeting is a lot of syllables for what's actually a very simple idea, right? That the people who are impacted by decisions should be the people who make those decisions. So at PBP, we support folks in educating themselves, advocating for, implementing, and improving participatory budgeting, which is a process that has 6 main steps, and I'm going to walk you through them very briefly because we could go into it for a long time. But it kicks off with winning PB, getting a pot of funds, and getting yourself together. And my favorite part of this whole process is the design phase, which is the part where you set up the kind of rules, the ways that you're going to interact with this participatory budgeting process, right? These processes can be anywhere from $5,000 to $27 million, like we saw in Seattle. And in the design phase, you establish a steering committee, which is the set of folks who are going to write the rules, which include things like who can submit ideas for the participatory budgeting process, what the voting age will be, right? Because it doesn't have to be 18. These are rules that we made for ourselves. Who will be the types of participants? Like we think about in New York City, we have folks who are undocumented, who are major participants in the participatory budgeting processes. So you make all these decisions. The design process part is my favorite part, so I could talk my whole introduction just about how you design a participatory budgeting process. But what happens after that is you open up the doors and you start idea collection, which is where folks get to start naming the kinds of ideas that they want to see in their community, what they want to see invested in. After that, we bring in budget delegates, who are folks who work with city officials, who work with subject matter experts, who work with experts in the community to turn those ideas into real proposals that can be voted on. Then the community comes in, votes, picks the ideas that will be funded. The ideas that don't get funded, though, do tend to inspire things that move forward, right? Because those ideas from community don't just get thrown away because they don't win on the ballot. And then after the winning projects are identified, they're implemented. And then there's the part that is super important, which is evaluation and starting it all over again. You look at the process, look at what went well, what went not so well, right? Because these are new ways of interacting with each other, and you improve that participatory budgeting process. So at PBP, we work with folks to win these funds. We work with folks to learn about how they can do it better. And we work with folks to implement and improve and work through evaluation. And I think that the part of participatory budgeting that is most exciting to me is the fact that through this process, there are the projects that win, there is the outcomes, but there is also a fundamental change in how people approach the decisions around them, whether that be budgeting decisions, whether that be policy decisions. Folks have a renewed sense of control and have a renewed sense of understanding that these decisions aren't just happening in a vacuum, right? People are making those decisions, and those people should be the ones who are most impacted.
Great, thanks, Rahel. Rich, could you introduce yourself and talk briefly about equity and transformation?
Yes, hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Richard Wallace. I'm the founding Executive Director of Equity and Transformation, also known as EAT. We're based in Chicago. I'm also a member of the policy table and strategy table at the Movement for Black Lives. At EAT, we serve Black informal workers. Black informal workers are folks that are boxed out of the formal economy due to things like ableism, transphobia, homophobia, sexism, the mark of a criminal record. And these workers are forced into the informal economy to make ends meet. Our mission ultimately is to build social and economic equity. We achieve that by four main pillars of work. We build alternatives that meet the immediate needs of our communities. We empower through Black wellness supports, and there's a range of activities we do within that. we grow, right? We believe that we got to have power, and in order to have power, without a bunch of money, is to have people who believe in the same mission and who can advocate for those solutions. So we grow through chapters, and then we inform, and that inform pillar is extremely important. That's our research, our communications, and our advocacy. So that's our work. Excited to be on the call or be on the panel, and look forward to kind of diving in deeper in a bit.
Thanks, Rich. Temi, could you introduce yourself and talk briefly about IF, a Foundation for Radical Possibility?
Yes, greetings, everybody. Happy to be here. My name is Temi F. Bennett. I'm co-CEO of IF, a Foundation for Radical Possibility. So about me, I'm an attorney by trade, living in Ward 5 in the Bloomingdale neighborhood of Northwest DC. I was raised in a Black nationalist Pan-African community on the south side of Chicago, so big up to Chicago. And I identify as a cisgender woman using she, her pronouns, and a Black feminist. I'm also a descendant of American enslavement. My folks were enslaved in North Carolina, Arkansas, and Virginia. I'm also a member of the Movement for Black Lives Policy Table and the Reparations Working Group. So for me, my people are Black people in America, Black people in the diaspora, and people of the global majority. So if you haven't caught on yet, I have a deep love and reverence for Black people. I do this work for my ancestors, for my current family and friends, and then for my future descendants. I said defendants. Look, already we do be defending ourselves. About IF. We are a private regional racial justice foundation based in DC. We fund in Southern Maryland, DC, and Northern Virginia. Our vision is that Black people and people of the global majority live powerfully, abundantly, and beautifully in healthy, self-determined communities free of social, economic, and ideological violence. We achieve our mission, our vision through centering the leadership and expertise of Black people and people of the global majority in the Washington, D.C. region who live at the sharpest intersections of systems of oppression, in particular, race, class, gender identity. And so we have 5 pillars that we do our work through. So that's community power, which is our participatory grant making, culture, which is our narrative change work. So we have a documentary coming out this year called Diminished Returns, all about the Black wealth gap in DC, healing justice, systems change work, that's our government portfolio, and then the systems change work we try to do in the philanthropic sector, and then reparations and economic justice. And I'll pause there, Steve.
Okay, thanks, Temi. And Amara, I'll let you, you'll get to be the last to introduce yourself and, talk about your work with Movement for Black Lives and about the series, because you weren't just the author of some of the pieces, but, really played a curatorial role in that series. So talk about what you were hoping to achieve.
Sure. Thank you so much, Steve, and to the MPQ team for the collaboration, and also to the panelists who are brilliant in their own right and also work for organizations that have really been at the front lines of what we are advancing, which is a vision for Black people that affects our material conditions, that moves us toward liberation. And that's really the fundamental basis of all of the work that we do. What is liberatory? What moves us toward being self-determining, self-sufficient, and free to thrive? And so with the Movement for Black Lives, that is a central part of the work that we do. So again, my name is Amara Enya, and I'm the policy director for the Movement for Black Lives. And we are an ecosystem of a few hundred Black-led organizations across the country doing work to win the rights, resources, and recognition for Black people. This work is held by Black folks that are in their communities on the ground. We have many base-building organizations that not only are executing the work, but it informs our policy platform. So the policy table, all of that work, what we put forth in the vision, is informed by people on the ground. It is a bottom-up orientation that is absolutely critical to make sure that whatever we're putting forth as our vision or policies are actually relevant and resonate with the people who are most affected. And so that was some of the thinking behind wanting to put together an economic policy vision for Black people. So we know that in 2020, which was 4 years ago, but it seems like it was just yesterday, it's a lot that's gone on. But around that time, it was essentially and still is a poly crisis. So we had the pandemic, at that point, the economic fallout from the pandemic. We had uprisings, not just across the United States, but around the world after the murder of George Floyd. There was a lot happening. We also had a change in the electoral side of things with the presidential election at that time. And so what became clear for us is that we definitely have to focus on what is an economic vision, what is a policy platform that we can advance for Black people that actually speaks to the very real issues that did not emerge in 2020, but that were exposed even further in the context of this polycrisis. So just some of the data points that people well know. So Black wealth, for every dollar of wealth that white people have, Black folks have 24 cents to the dollar. We know that when it comes to housing affordability, now it's about 42%. People are spending about 42% of their household income just on housing alone. We are seeing the rates of evictions, the unhoused numbers skyrocketing, and it's of course affecting Black people. We even at M4BL had looked into some of the systems that seem to escape scrutiny, if you will. There's a myth of objectivity about so many of the systems and institutions that govern our day-to-day lives. And so we looked at the tax system, and we found, and this was also a study that was put forth at Stanford University and some other researchers, that found that Black people are actually audited more by the IRS. Not only are they audited more, they are penalized more by the IRS. And this is the same IRS that, one, refuses to collect racial demographic data, but also that has a system that ensures that those who have wealth actually benefit from the tax code, which means white people. So those who have not been discriminated against through redlining, through being excluded from access to FHA loans, et cetera, those who've built up their wealth over years are actually the beneficiaries of this tax system. And Black folks are actually harmed by the tax system. Yet there's this notion of objectivity, like we pay taxes and it's just an objective way of that it's an objective process. So we wanted to really look at those institutional mechanisms that have actually been harmful and to propose what are the interventions that can actually move us toward our liberation, move us toward at least repairing harm, right? And making sure that we are not continuously being exploited and harmed by the economic system. And our economic power is tied very closely to our political power. We know the dynamics of the link between economics and politics. And so it was really important that we focus on an economic vision as well. The other thing I wanted to draw attention to is the Black radical roots of our economic policy vision and economic justice writ large. So in the opening piece for the series, I mentioned that the Black Panther Party in 1966 released their 10-point plan. Number 2 of that plan was a call for full employment. There's a mirror, if you will, with a lot of the work that is taking place across the country. And I think Rich has been involved in that work around guaranteed basic income pilots, right? But again, that was number 2 of the Black Panthers' 10-point plan, was a call for full employment. Number 3 of the Black Panther Party's 10-point plan was demanded 40 acres and 2 mules. So that was number 3. And to accept that payment, the payment of that debt of 40 acres and 2 mules in currency as an alternative, right? So this is in 1966. We also have civil rights activists like Fannie Lou Hamer, who started the Freedom Farm Cooperative. So we've touched on a little bit around solidarity economy, and it's important to contextualize that with work that's happened long before the present time. And Fannie Lou Hamer's Freedom Farm Cooperative secured 200 units of low-income housing. They also owned, the cooperative served more than 1,600 families in the Mississippi Delta. The housing program created housing for 70 families, right? So this is some of the historical context to an economic vision, the Black radical tradition of an economic vision for Black people. And I wanted to just kind of wrap up with a quote from Malcolm X, who in 1964 of course, he gave a speech called the Black Revolution. And there's a notion of community control that is absolutely imperative. And it's why you'll hear in the series we talk about participatory budgeting and this notion of community control of the institutions that are in our communities, or the institutions that govern our lives. So in 1964, Malcolm X said, and this is a quote, "Our economic philosophy is that we should gain economic control over the economy of our own community, the businesses, and the other things which create employment, so that we can provide jobs for our own people instead of having to picket and boycott and beg someone else for a job." And that's just a snippet of that speech. There are other quotes that I can list off if we had time from Fannie Lou Hamer and others talking about an economic vision. And so we are following that pathway as we set forth a vision through this series and through our work.
Great. Thanks, Samara, for really setting the stage. And, I want to ask other folks on the panel to weigh in on the Black radical roots of today's economic justice vision. So whoever wants to go first, we'll pass it around.
I really appreciate Amara's opening to center us, because I too agree. At 1DC, we would also add on and emphasize the things that Amara talked about. So for us, it's about three buckets in terms of who we look to. So the Black revolutionary struggle, both domestically and internationally. I'm thinking particularly of Neville Alexander, and who was associated with the ANC before in the fighting against the apartheid in South Africa. And one of the things that he mentioned was that the revolutionary struggle, the Black revolutionary struggle, required rolling back of the market in very concrete ways. So making sure the market doesn't dominate and is not used to meet our basic needs in terms of shelter, clothing, et cetera. And then, of course, like Amara just said, transforming the state, and then practicing those cooperatives, as she mentioned, with Fannie Lou Hamer. But then in relation to that, I think at 1DC, we also stress that there's this need for us to focus on lifting up Black working class property rights struggles, our struggles against the constant commodification and speculation around housing. And so thinking about the traditions of Chicago and how the organizing against the predatory lending, the organizing that was happening against the disinvestment that led to the Community Reinvestment Act. And also in DC, thinking about our context in terms of DC creating a tenants' rights culture politically and fighting for rent control, although we can talk about rent control in our accommodations with capitalism, or racial capitalism specifically. And then the last thing that I think I wanted to just emphasize that Amara shared already was our movement solidarity with Indigenous people. I think at 1DC and many of the movement organizations that are on this call, we're very much committed to trying to think about how dispossession is an ongoing practice, one that we've learned from Indigenous people here and around the world, that's very much committed to settler colonialism. And so constantly using property rights and using the courts in the states, as well as investor capital, which I'm sure we'll talk about soon, to constantly justify that ongoing dispossession, and then speculating and then commodifying even more the land and debt tied to that land.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I agree. Dr. Amara, it's always hard, because you laid out a canvas and I'm like, I'm just going to add to it a little bit. I'll put the little dots on there. But again, I think, coming from the Movement for Black Lives, also thinking about the organization, the home team, Equity and Transformation, also known as E. What comes to mind for me when I think about the roots, I got to go back to conflict theory, right? Like I got to get, anti-capitalism, in particular conflict theory, which focuses on competition among groups within society over limited resources when we know there is an abundance. I say that specifically because I'm in Chicago right now and we're dealing with the quote unquote migrant crisis. And you're starting to see the politics and the origins of scarcity surface in a city where we're the fifth largest, one of the largest economies in the world. Self-determination, essentially empowering communities to control their economic destinies, right? So community control over the means of distribution, however you talk about that. That also comes from the Black Panther Party. So definitely reflecting on Chairman Fred's vision in Chicago. In addition to that, I think there's deep roots as it relates to internationalism. The idea that we as Black people will only be as free as Mother Africa at the end of the day. And that our freedom in the U.S. is intrinsically linked to the freedom of all Black bodies, right, across the globe. In addition, there's abolition, right? And abolition is a twofold commitment, not to just dismantle, because I see a lot of half-hearted abolitionists out there that are hell-bent on the dismantle conversation, but are novice at best as it relates to what it is we're trying to rebuild. And so it's a twofold commitment along the lines of dismantling harmful systems, imagining new possibilities, piloting those possibilities, right? That means testing those possibilities, because sometimes they don't work, even though they sound great on paper. They don't work, right? Piloting those possibilities and building the alternatives, right? And last but not least, I think, which is the topic of the piece that I was able to produce, was reparations. And there should be full repair for the harms of chattel slavery and imperialism. And so I think those are the historic roots. And I think there's a lot of, I often think about a lot of the policy advocacy fights within the U.S. as being like, just imagine you had a whole apple and you cut it into a million pieces, right? All of those little pieces, that full apple is reparations, right? And so we're fighting over here for this particular policy, which aids and assists us in achieving this larger outcome of reparations. But when we get the whole apple, right, that is that we have received compensation, we have received rehabilitation, we have acquired restitution, there's been guarantees of non-repetition, and the people are satisfied. And so for me, reparations is that full pie, right? And so, I'm sure we'll dig in deeper into in the particular questions that you'll ask, but that's where I feel like the historic radical roots are where they stem from.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'm just going to add, because I agree with everything that's been said. And I agree that we have to look at our, historic models. And one that has been mentioned is like Shirley Sherrod. And like not just the farm, I'm talking about the plan that they really had at birth, which was a self-determined Black town, right? That had education, that had employment, they had all the things. And so for us, we're really with a goal to self-determination, and honing in on, like, as far as the path to get there is really rooted in the principles of Ujima and Ujamaa, right? So I'm talking about collective work and responsibility and cooperative economics. Is collectively getting there together, and with this goal of self-determination. I think that goes to like all the things that have been said, and I'll pause there.
I feel like y'all just said so much that I want like a webinar on each thing that just came up. But I think across the thing that comes up for me is a major part of self-determination is the idea that what we're trying to do is not join the system that is existing, right? It's not about, particularly when we're talking about like in participatory budgeting or like in participatory democracy work, right? It's not that we want a Black face in a high place, right? We're not looking to simply incorporate into a system that has proven time and time again that it not only was not built for us, but it was built actively against us, right? And so a major part of this self-determination, I appreciate, Rich, that you brought up the building part that comes after this, the dismantling, is iteration and experimentation and trying things together and building that trust in order to do that. And a part of the radical tradition is that necessity of trust, right? And like of needing to be prepared to try something that hasn't been tried before, because we've seen what has been tried before fail. And we've not only seen it fail, but we have been the ones that it failed on, right? We are best positioned. I think that within the Black radical tradition, Black folks across the world are best positioned to set up what a vision for justice looks like because of the ways that the systems that exist have actively worked against us, and that like intimate knowledge that we have. We talk about content expertise, right? The folks who really know how much it costs to do this and that project. But what we at PPP a lot talk about is context expertise, right? The people who live on that street know a lot better, right? Why that is so important, because what does that impact have? How does it roll into people's safety? How does it roll into people's ability to like thrive in their community? So I think that like that piece of self-determination is really key, that we're not simply trying to join the system that exists.
Very amazing answers, everyone. Temi, I wanted to ask you, to expand on the topic that you were interviewed by Amara on the philanthropic case for reparations, and I'm aware that you guys came out with or contributed to a report recently as well. But lay out the case for how philanthropy should be thinking about reparations.
Yeah, I think the case for reparations for the philanthropic sector is a case for reparations for everybody, right? Black folks are owed a debt. And on top of that debt, the wealth that this country holds does not belong to the people that hold it. And so as an organization, we came out for the first time as an organization in support of reparations to Black people in 2020 in our 10-year strategic plan. And the question that we got to, because we were an HMO conversion. So our money came from the sale of the assets of an HMO. And we were Consumer Health Foundation. So a health equity organization focused around racial equity and the social determinants of health. But in 2020, we were having our board and staff retreat doing strategic planning, and we were doing the verses. Y'all remember verses during COVID, where it was an artist against another artist. And so the verses for us was racial equity versus racial justice. And the question that was asked was, what do Black people need to heal? And the answer was an acknowledgement, right? An acknowledgement of the intentional harm done to a collective people. And then with that acknowledgement came an obligation to repair, right? So it wasn't out of charity or out of our philanthropic good-heartedness that we are censoring Black people in this work and that we are saying that they are owed a debt. It was out of an obligation and a duty to repair because of past harms. And so for us, that felt like justice, not equity. And so we shifted to this racial justice lens, and we shifted to be a private foundation centering Black people. And with that came our stance on reparations. And yes, we believe that government owes reparations. We believe that at the local level and at the federal level, but also we believe that the sector owes repair and redress as well. And so we are advocating for reparations at the government level. So we are actively, we had the hearing in DC for our task force last June. We funded and organized around that. We also are funding a coalition right now that's facilitated by a friend of ours, Ronnie Gavin, who is pushing the advocacy right at the local level. But then, and then we're doing some work in Maryland as well. But then, we also felt like the sector owes a debt, and so the same way that somebody could say that the government owes a debt, somebody can say that to all philanthropic organizations. And so we wanted to learn more about our wealth origin. And so we commissioned NCRP. NCRP is the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy back in 2021 to develop a report and to research our wealth origin and to come up with a qualitative number and let us know how we got our origin and how much of that wealth was extracted from Black genius and Black labor, right? With this goal of redress. And I'll tell you, it's been a journey. So the report came out in January, end of January. We're very excited about it. It is called Cracks in the Foundation, Philanthropy's Role in Reparations to Black People. And it is looking at our endowment and the endowments of 7 other foundations in the region, so 8 total. And we're the only volunteer participants, so I won't sugarcoat it. The other 7 foundations are not happy about this report, and we're very upset. And so it illuminates ways, there is power in naming the thing. We can say all day that Black people are owed a debt, but once you start coming out with the receipts, it feels very different, and people do feel targeted, right? And as they should, because we're speaking directly to them and we're speaking directly to the sector. This methodology, we believe, can be replicated. This is a pilot. We hope that other foundations will do the same thing. And this is just about the wealth origin, right? But it's not just about wealth origin. It's about where your endowment is now, where are you invested in right now, right? If you're giving out 5% of your wealth towards, and most of them are not going to Black-led organizations, right? Most of them are not going to the BIPOC organizations. But if you're only giving out 5%, but the majority of your wealth is in private prisons and in guns and in extractive investments, then you're a part of the problem. So it's not just wealth origin, it's where you're invested now, it's who holds your wealth, who are your wealth managers. And so all of that we believe should be on the table when we're talking about philanthropic redress to Black people. And I can pause there because there's a lot I could say about this report, but I think we're sending the link so people could download it. Please check it out.
Yeah, I did put the link in the chat. So, and it is a powerful report, and really, especially if you go to the appendices, you'll see exactly what Temi is
The
talking
individual
about.
wealth histories.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Richard, I wanted to throw it to you, and you write about the effects of the war on drugs and mass incarceration, and a call for reparations and public policy around that. Sort of lay out the case of what you were talking about.
Yeah. So again, representing equity and transformation here in Chicago. A really unique story on how we landed on drug war reparations, but we fought for, again, we organized Black informal workers. Those are folks that are boxed out of the formal economy. And so in the informal economy, what we learned is that occupations are not fixed. They often migrate between informal and formal, right? So you have folks that were bootleggers, right? Some of the best bootleggers in the world were Black folks, right? But the second it becomes formal, right, it's now legal, right? After Prohibition, all of that, right? It becomes legal, you see a lack of retention in Black ownership in the other side of the sector, right? Once it becomes formalized. Same thing happens with ride sharing. Same thing happened with like number running, right? And so when we started noticing this trend, we began to organize Black cannabis sellers in the legacy market to advocate for entry into the recreational market, right? At the time, there was a medical market in the city of Chicago, and there was 40 to 45 dispensaries, all owned and operated by white people. There was not one Black owner in the medical industry and in the medical cannabis industry. And so that policy fight was our first policy fight. Shout out to Pure Cannabis Coalition. And we won the first recreational cannabis policy to incorporate reparations for the war on drugs. That was important that they stood on stage and said, this is about reparations, because now we holding their feet to the fire. Because what we saw after the first year is that although there were, under cannabis legalizations, there was about 2,000 some odd arrests, and 80% of those arrested under legalization were Black people. And so we began to assess, okay, well, where are we going? How is this reparations if our people are still continuously being harmed? And in reality, what we had was very short. It fell short, extremely short from reparations. And so we began to build this larger drug war reparations campaign that we call the Big Payback in the city of Chicago. And now we're fighting for, and I think, again, as abolitionists, we're not just saying, what the problem is. We're actually active in developing the alternative, right? So we piloted a program around compensation called the Chicago Future Fund, which gave direct cash payments to formerly incarcerated people, survivors of the war on drugs, for 18 months. And it was a study. We looked at income volatility, psychological, all of those good things. And then we began to, and we're in a stage now where we did, the other part that is very important is that the work can't live on these Zooms. The work has to live in the communities. If we talking about solidarity economy, if we talking about reparations, if we talking about any of those things, if the people aren't saying that when they knock on doors, right? If they ain't demanding that in that moment, right, then we losing, right? Because we can't do it alone. We actually need people. We got to move people, right? So a big part of last year at Equity and Transformation was like building up that base of community advocates that could speak to this and demand this, right? Because at the end of the day, that's how democracy works, unfortunately. And so, you know what I mean? They need an educated base of their constituents, quote unquote, to do the right thing. And so we did that political education. But I do want to say, and so we are fighting for compensation right now, right? But I am a firm believer in, comprehensive reparations, right? And I will say very clearly that both mass incarceration, the war on drugs, and the war on drugs are products of anti-Black racism, right? Which is a well thought out strategy, right? beyond the harms that each one of them caused, they served as modes to operationalize existing racist ideals held by white supremacists, right? So in other words, mass incarceration, the war on drugs are just modes to operationalize this like white supremacy, right? It's a way to other Black people, right? The 13th Amendment essentially makes us slaves again. When we come home after doing time and I'm formerly incarcerated, right? We got 1,300 collateral consequences in the state of Illinois, over 1,100, my bad, collateral consequences of permanent punishments in the state of Illinois, limiting access to housing, education, so on and so forth, right? So this system of white supremacy has to end, right? And I think that reparations is a pathway to that, right? Because it provides that guarantee of non-repetition. It also has a pillar of restitution, right? Which means ultimately that we're going to restore survivors of a particular harm to the condition they were in before the harm occurred. And so for me, that's reconnecting myself and my story and my family story and our lineage, right? Back to land, language, and lineage, right? So that's going back to the continent of Africa. I think for a lot of us, my story begins in Arkansas and Jackson, Mississippi. So a big part of my story before the transatlantic slave trade, right, is it's been stolen from me. So restitution means that I'm going to be restored, right? And also I feel like that gives a bit of homage to those ancestors that survived the transatlantic slave trade. Because if we end the story with the moment they stepped on this soil, right, then we're doing a disservice to the ancestors that came before us. So for me, I feel like full comprehensive reparations is a necessary antidote, right, to achieving, I think, what we talked about earlier: anti-capitalism, self-determination, abolition, those frameworks, right? And so again, that's where I'm coming from the city of Chicago. That's a campaign that we're leading at Equity and Transformation. It's called the Big Payback. We are fighting for drug war reparations, but we see the drug war as one of the modes. We saw the 3/5 clause as one of the modes. We saw Jim Crow as one of the modes, black codes as one of the modes, redlining as one of the modes. This is the mode that we fell into due to our advocacy around Black informal workers. And so the same remedy applies for each, right? Restitution, rehabilitation, compensation, guarantees of non-repetition, and satisfaction. I'll close with that.
Thanks, Rich. That's amazing. Rahel, I'm going to move the conversation to you and talk about participatory budgeting and how does it lead to more effective community-based decision making regarding the allocation of public resources?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, thank you, Temi and Rich. I'm changing my thoughts as y'all speak, so I appreciate that. I always say that participatory budgeting is a tool, right? It's a method, it's an approach. And the thing that really has come up quite a bit in hearing y'all, Rich and Temi, is this idea of repair. And the part of repair that people are very hesitant around is the part that comes before. And Temi, you named it, it's acknowledgement. So one example that I named in my article that I'll talk through a little bit more is LA Repair, which is a participatory budgeting process happening in the city of LA, which is focused on a type of equity that makes people quite uncomfortable, right? Which is the type where you look at what happened, you acknowledge it, and you actually distribute funds and think about how you're going to move through the participatory process with that acknowledgement in mind, right? So this is not a citywide process. It's focused and based on key repair zones, which were identified through particular kind of indications, right, of impacts of white supremacy, impacts of systematic anti-Black racism, and disinvestment, right? So this included things like employment and poverty data, home access to internet, impacts of COVID-19 case rates, right? Because we saw how that was disproportionately impacting our communities. And those repair zones are doing participatory processes, and they're currently actually in their vote right now to actively address the ways that these indicators of well-being, or these indicators of how a community is thriving or not, are not incidental, right? They are based on historic disinvestment, historic targeting, and historic purposeful criminalization and the kind of legacy of that. And so there's no way that you're going to be able to correct anything without first acknowledging that. And they've been moving through that. Obviously, it has its limitations. It is in its kind of pilot beginning phases. But I think that one important thing that it shows is that when you use participatory budgeting and participatory processes as a method to directly and like really boldly face what legacies you're standing on, there's a lot of opportunity to have conversations that you're not having otherwise, right? You're not going to have these conversations during an election cycle about how a particular neighborhood was particularly targeted. You're not going to have conversations about how you use actual money to think about how Skid Row has been targeted specifically by economic disinvestment. And so I think that that's one of the major strengths of participatory budgeting, is that it is a tool that folks can use to open up really important conversations and actually have them in a bold and impactful way that puts real impact, real money behind those conversations, right? Not a couple of candidates having a discussion about how this community is feeling the impacts of white supremacy, but actually putting that money into communities' hands to decide what to do with it and start a process of real repair that involves an exchange of power. Another key part of how Participatory Budgeting Project has been thinking about participatory processes as a tool to move towards justice has been other forms of participatory democracy, right? Our current representative democracy is purposely built in order to enact anti-Black racism, right? It is, representative democracy cannot be the method by which we get free. We need to rethink democracy, and we need to think about a version of democracy that is about more shared power, that is about shared decision-making, that is about community holding decision-making power, not simply shifting what single individual is holding that overall power, right? So we're working through Democracy Beyond Elections, which is a coalition where we're partnering with other folks to think about other forms of participatory democracy, thinking about community assemblies, right, where folks are able to move through decisions, participatory policy making, where folks are able to like actually have a say in the policies that are impacting their lives. And we see what happens when that is not the case, right? We see the impacts of the war on drugs. We see the impact of all these policies that were made behind closed doors by our representatives who don't represent us. They represent the interests of white supremacy. And so in order to actually have a system that represents us, we have to be the ones representing ourselves, and we have to have direct democracy. Another key thing that I'll kind of name and pass along after is that the kind of education piece you talked about, Rich, is so important and is one of the tools that I think that representative democracy, I think like folks who want to be gatekeepers, folks who want to say that we can't do participatory processes lean on, right? Is that, oh, well, you know, you elected us to make these decisions because we know more, right? Or we, you know, have whatever base of knowledge. And that is simply not the case. It's about access, right? And so if we are willing to really put our full strength behind political education, behind making sure that our people have the access to that kind of education, there is no reason why those decisions cannot be in our hands around dollars and cents, that kind of investment, behind policy, behind the real things that we are the actual experts on. But what is lacking is a willingness to invest in political education, a willingness to invest in actual power sharing and power that is not representative, right? Power that is not about, oh, I pick you to take my power, but is actually about growing and learning together and being willing to move through that. So yeah, I'll pause there.
Thanks, Rahel. Rosemary, I wanted to pass the baton to you, and you know, we talked about the Black radical economic vision before. You know, apply that to the housing justice work you're involved in.
Again, appreciative of my panelists who went prior to me, also inspired me to add some and modify some things. So of course, the value of having the goal of decommodified housing that's rooted in gender, racial, and indigenous justice. That would require that we start to unpack some very ugly truths about our economy. So in this country, 20% of our gross domestic product is housing related. It's all about the housing economy. And so from mortgages to developing, building these homes, we're all very much, even our retirement, our 401ks, we're all very much implicated in holding up this speculative investment in land and housing. And so one of the first steps would be that we again acknowledge the extent to which we are all invested in this project of holding up property rights through, private ownership. That would then require us to then pressure our national and local officials on redirecting our financial resources to actually invest in the things that we value, which are cooperatives, investing in a responsive state that actually plays a redistributive role as opposed to the role that it plays now, which essentially subsidizes capital accumulation. And so that would mean at 1DC, one of the things that we deeply invest in is making sure that we expand and preserve deeply affordable housing. We can talk more about the financing and how that actually hinders the financing. And then also what Amara talks about in her article is the professional class that I think is constantly modifying and mediating who actually gets access to these resources. But we would need to invest in shifting the financial structure over time, and this will be generations, to get us away from this speculative investment in debt and housing. Then we would also have to think about how we're going to build up our alternative institutions. One of the biggest historical weaknesses is that we've had great historical examples of co-ops, but one of the hardest things about sustaining co-ops is having the infrastructure, both the educational apparatus, but then also the financial apparatus to sustain these cooperatives when leadership transitions or when external forces, because this country is so deeply invested in private ownership that's oriented towards profit accumulation, you'll have constant external attacks on these cooperatives. And so spending more time in investing in these educational infrastructure and cooperative servicing groups that actually help to train. And then the last big thing about that infrastructure and establishing a working class infrastructure oriented towards cooperatives is also unpacking and developing more popular means of educating the entire American society on how we need to actually disinvest from ideas of home ownership being the ideal form of actually getting included in American quote unquote democratic capitalism. So that would mean going and challenging those ideas about home ownership, which are very much related on this idea that there's a hierarchy of stewardship or ownership, which means that would mean going at our wealth generation strategies. So for the last 50 or so years in this post-civil rights era, we've had more access to these markets in terms of the home ownership markets, and we have many, many more Black entrepreneurs who are using access to debt and ownership of homes as a way for them to generate their wealth origin and their wealth generation strategy on the backs of many of us, many other working class folks. And so we would need to challenge this investor strategy, even amongst our own. And then the last thing is developing like you all just said, a commitment to acknowledging the extent to which we're all invested in it and being honest about how we can support each other, because this isn't about shaming. We all have it. I have a retirement account as well, 401k as well. And so we would then need to think through ways we can talk to each other about ways that we ourselves are actually investing in alternatives, whether that be cooperatives, credit unions, things of that sort, alternative institutions that actually are invested in cooperative stewardship over land and housing. I think I'll keep it there.
Great, thanks, Rosemary. Amara, I'm gonna go to you, and then I'm actually gonna combine a question with a question from the audience. So the question I was gonna ask you is what narrative changes are needed to advance the policy vision? And then I'm gonna add to this a question that's Trevor Smith put in the chat. What role does shifting culture and anti-Black narratives play in this work, and how do we go about shifting neoliberal culture and uplifting pro-Black narratives? So I think those are related. So I'm throwing them both at you, and then others can also reply afterward.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, I just wanted to lift up all of the comments in the chat and the insights. I haven't been able to follow everything, but I've tried to follow some, and it's so rich. And so I just wanted to express my gratitude to all of the attendees for sharing those insights, as well as to the panelists. On this question of narrative and the role that it plays in shifting, really in shifting realities. I mean, I think narrative shift is critical. But it's a couple of things. So anyone who's been in the reparations space, and I know there are some veterans in this event, knows that 4 years ago, 5 years ago, these conversations were not happening. A mere few years ago, it was like the R word. There were a group of, faithful activists who've been for decades been at this work. And something happened, the unpredictability of life, if you will. A space was created where the work that those faithful had done and have done, there was a turning point, and all of a sudden there was a possibility that was opened up for reparations to be talked about openly, boldly, at the local, state, national, and international level in ways that are unprecedented. What that means is that there was a shift, not just in the narrative, but because of that work to shift hearts and minds, to get our people first and foremost to believe that the status quo is not all there is. And really, that's the first thing. If we don't believe that an alternative reality is possible, then we won't even get to the point of the kind of narrative that can shift other people's thinking. And so on that, really being clear about the fact that vision and policy are not the same thing. And I think it's important to articulate that. So when we talk about vision and what we envision for ourselves, we've heard self-determination, right, as a fundamental right of Black people. Self-determination is not a policy. Self-determination is what we're shooting for, right? That's our vision. What does it mean to be self-determining? The policies are just the ways that we operationalize to move toward that vision that we have. And so the policies can shift over time. The policies can be anything that we can imagine them to be because they move us toward a vision that we have for ourselves. And I think in these spaces, because what I've noticed in the policy world is that it can be exclusionary, where policy professionals use language to intentionally obscure, to create distance between the people in their communities, our people, and those who are actually making decisions that govern our day-to-day lives. Policy tends to do that. And so what Rich mentioned about base building and about if we're not actually talking to our people, talking with our people, then we're really not doing the fundamental work because we're not going to win any hearts and minds and change belief if we can't even talk to the people who actually are closest to the issues. That's the work that we have to do. That's what actually feeds into narrative shift, which then can move us toward the kind of cultural shift that is necessary to actualize the vision that we have. So it is about recognizing what our vision is, the kinds of policies that move us toward our vision. And the last thing that I'll add is we have to get comfortable rejecting the premise. Now, I'm the type of person, I reject the premise on anything and everything. I just operate that way. I've always kind of been oriented that way. So if you tell me, oh, this is the global order, I'm going to say, well, why? Oh, this is the way the economic system, well, why? Says who? Right? Whose imagination are we living in right now? That's the key question, because we are actually living in the imagination of individuals who believe that destroying the earth, exploiting people, enslaving people is somehow the kind of world that we should live in. That's an imagination that has become real, and now it is our reality. So our question is, or our charge, our mandate, at least I'll speak for myself, my mandate is to reject every premise of every institution that governs the present day. Why? Because we're living in the results of that. So we can't even accept, and we shouldn't accept, for example, that, oh, that the tax system, it's just the way that it works. Why? Because we know that it's designed to benefit some at the expense of others. Our monetary system, our education system, philanthropy, we can't just accept that these are the benevolence, and so we are getting the results of benevolence through philanthropy. No, they built philanthropic organizations built on the racial capitalist system that governs the world and continues to exploit people. And so this report that Temi mentioned, it shines a light on that. And it should cause us to question the premise of every institution and to tap into the imaginative power that we have, which is our birthright, that we have to create the kinds of policies and to put forth the policies that move us toward our vision. Why? Because we can. Other people did. There's no reason why we cannot do the same and more, but ours will be grounded in values of justice and what I lean into, African humanism, that recognizes our humanity as all people, but especially, as Black people. And so if we can do that, then the narrative shift, I think, will follow that. And it will sort of create the pathway for us to now actualize the kinds of policies that create the institutions that are actually life-affirming.
Great, thanks. So I think going through audience questions, there's a couple of questions here, so I'm going to kind of combine them around policy and, are there specific policy recommendations each of you would have and any policy wins that you would like to lift up? So we can go around and see what, whoever wants to jump in first.
I'm happy to kick us off. The premise that I'm going to set up, right, is that any policy should be built with the input and the decision-making of the people, right, who it's going to impact. And so when we talk about participatory budgeting, we talk about these processes, but actually the overall goal is a systematic change in the way that budgeting decisions are made, right? It's not about a single process. It's about changing the idea that, in a city of 1 million people, these 30 people decide how the budget gets spent. And really just flipping that on its head and saying, actually, the people who are impacted by those budgeting decisions should make those decisions. And so I would point to New York City's CEC, the Office of Civic Engagement, which has been set up through the people of New York speaking for themselves. And in New York City, we've gone from 4 city council districts doing participatory budgeting to now the majority of the city council districts do participatory budgeting. And the people of New York became familiar with it, put it on the ballot, having citywide participatory budgeting and setting up an office that would make this institutionalized, right? That this is a part of how budget decisions get made. And this office exists and is now continuing to experiment and continuing to radicalize how participatory budgeting happens in the city and is continuing to grow that. It's a process, right? It's always going to be growing and changing, but I would claim that as a win because it's a fundamental and institutionalized change in how decisions get made. That is not about a one-off. It's not about here's a chance to do something. Here you go, you're empowered. No, it's about actually fundamentally changing the system, challenging ourselves to engage with that change in the system and making sure that can't be backed away from. I would also just shout out some of the cities that are doing their own kind of ways of institutionalizing participatory budgeting to varying degrees. So in Boston, folks are moving to make it so that every year a certain percentage of the city budget has to go into participatory budgeting. The same kind of battles are happening in Portland, they're happening in Cleveland. And the thing that remains the same in all of these is that the folks who are, to me at least, making the most specific and the most motivating argument for why this needs to be institutionalized are the folks who are involved in Black organizing, right? Are the people who are able to point to why this is the only way that the city can actually make budget decisions that are reflective of what the city needs, is by making sure that that power is in the hands of the people. So, it's not a direct policy, but I'm like, yeah, change how your budgeting process happens before you even get to the point of the decision making. Change how those decisions get made.
Rich, do you want to go?
Go ahead, Timmy.
So I think there are a few things I want to say. So one is like when it comes to even repair and what Black people need, right? I think there are various people have so many different definitions on what reparations is for Black people, but there are key elements that have to happen, right? And so three of them. One is resources, and we're talking like land and money, right? The other one is like policies and programs, and people have all kinds of areas where they want policies and programs, and it can be wealth building, education, housing, criminal legal system, environment, health, employment, so many, democracy, so many different things. And the third one, though, is the most dubious of them all, and that's the end to the anti-Blackness, right? And that is that non-repeat, right? And that is the most dubious because this country is built on anti-Blackness, and it's inherent in our systems. Like even today, like FBI just came out with a report. The top survivors of hate crimes are African Americans, like Black people, but specifically African Americans in this country. And there is no stop the anti-Black hate. We don't see those campaigns anywhere, right? Because of the insidiousness of anti-Blackness in this country and how inherent it is. And so I wouldn't say there's a policy that we should do and we should be pushing, but we should be learning history and you should be developing your analysis, particularly on race. And so as Rahel talked about, like the participatory budgeting is a tool. Racial equity impact assessments are tools. Racial equity action plans are tools. There are tools everywhere. We have a few on our website if you want to check them out. But the whole point of whatever it is that you're trying to decide, policy, decision, procedure, practice, is to run it through that tool and have an analysis, because the whole point of these tools are to find out who's going to benefit and who's going to be burdened by that decision, policy, procedure, and practice. And oftentimes it's going to be Black folks that are going to be burdened, right, with a benefit or an advantage to white folks. That's just the way the system is created. That is structural racism. And so we're asking you to develop that analysis so you can figure that shit out yourself. And we're saying, and when you see who's going to benefit and who's going to be burdened, when you see that it's going to be BIPOC folks and Black folks, then you redo that decision. That's it. Develop your own analysis, particularly on race, because that's how it operates in this country and in this context. And other thing I will say, absolutely agree with destruction and construction. We got to be able to dream the alternative. And I want to lift up what Amara talked about. The goal is not to get what white people have. That is not the goal. And so that goes to that visioning and that construction and that radical imagination of a world that could be. And it's probably going to be like this. The secret is going to be an Afrofuturism. So go pick up some books, particularly Octavia Butler. But yeah.
Yeah, family. Yeah, this is a great discussion. We can go on all day. I feel like I'm sitting at the kitchen table with y'all and we talking. And there's a bunch of people that are listening, but I didn't, I'm not thinking about it right now. So I was thinking to myself, the goal of an organizer is to lift up the contradictions, right? So if you're in a state that doesn't currently have cannabis legalization on the docket, it's coming. They're making way too much tax revenue for it not to show up. And so I think when you're thinking about strategy, cannabis legalization is a very explicit contradiction to the 94 crime bill, the war on drugs, so on and so forth. And so in those moments, we actually have to use the leverage of that contradiction in order to establish policy that creates, I would say, material changes for the communities that we serve. And so what we were able to secure in Illinois was 25% of the cannabis tax revenue, right? And so one of the biggest challenges with most like GI pilots, guaranteed income, this, that, the compensation components is that they don't really have a targeted resource generator, right? And so in Illinois, just for instance, like that tax revenue, let me go to this. Shout out to Rachel Pine on our team. Shout out to Ticey, who's on the call too. But that tax revenue in Illinois was $238 million in the first year of legalization, of which, the R3 got $49 million, right? And so that's perpetuitous, right? That's going on for forever. So these resources are just going to continue to build. And so if we're saying, so I think being smart in strategy, assessing like where is the federal cannabis legalization at? When is it going to take place in my state? Is there if you have a medical industry in your state, recreational is coming around the corner. They use them little white babies to open up the door for the medical industry, and then they monopolize. And so we got to get ready and get prepared for that fight in those states. And then there was a question in here from Esteban that I want to just jump into real quick, and it was around enacting reparations framework. It's like, it's like what comes first, the chicken or the egg kind of a thing. And for me, I feel like a lot of times we lead these conversations as it relates to the readiness of Black community from an ableist perspective, right? As if they don't learn the same way all people learn, right? And whether that be through your failings, et cetera, right? And I'll use an example because I like to use real life. We had a lot of folks in Illinois, Black folks, who were excited about recreational cannabis because you couldn't get a license unless you came from generally Black, brown communities across the state. Now, a lot of them thought they can go at it by themselves, that rugged individualism that capitalism is like, teaches you. And they couldn't, right? It's not my job to sit up with them and be like, you can't do it. You can't do it by yourself. That's, man, nobody taught. I mean, I had to literally bump my head up against the wall 1,000 times before I started to harvest the seeds, right? And so for me, it's like we have to walk with our people through those contradictions, hold their hand, be with them, opposed to just saying like ostracizing them for operating in the only way they've been socialized to operate for a very long time, right? And that's what it takes to be an organizer. An organizer is not about condemnation, right? It's about holding, right, through contradictions, through failures, through whatever, through successes, right? And then being like, oh, there's another way, right? Or letting them find it, dang, there's a better way. So now you got folks in Chicago that are like, man, Joe, I got 10,000. How many you got? I got 10,000. Whatever the case may be, that are building what we would call cooperatives, right, or collectives in order to enter this market, right? But that didn't come through us ostracizing them and telling them that they can't do it alone, right? It's like the people will get there just like each one of us. We didn't wake up Marxist, anti-capitalist, whatever. It was like, man, I learned through failure, right? And so for me as an organizer, it's not our job to assess, you know what I'm saying, the readiness of community as it relates to resources around compensation, right? And if we give it back to them, if somebody go out and buy some Jordans, it's not my, man, people will probably buying, whatever brings you joy. Get what you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not, you know what I mean? That's not my job, right? But my job is to give, and I think the importance is that self-determination of community and walking with people through the contradictions. I'm gonna shut up. But it was great being here, and yeah, shout out to all of
y'all. Rosemary, anything you want to say about One DC and some of the wins you guys have had?
Yes, but shout out to everybody else, because I really do agree. Particularly, Rich, your point resonated a lot with me. Your last point about an organizer walking with folks as we all untangle our contradictions. Because I think that's something One DC does well too, in the sense that we will literally say, okay, we want to stay in our homes. We know that we're existing in racial capitalism, all that stuff. We're forced to be tenants. And then tenants will say, okay, well, we want to get a huge buyout. I don't know if I think I starting this conversation about how we have this unique law. And so one of the ways that landlords step around it is they give buyouts. They try to give buyouts to the tenants so the tenants don't contest their TOPA rights. And so, of course, that is an easy, low-hanging fruit. And so we're like, okay, we've organized with tenants who said, we're going to take this buyout. And then we've also worked with tenants who said, no, F that. I know that $10,000 is not going to get me nowhere and they're going to tax me anyway. It's going to go right back to the state. And that became a way for us to actually have these more concrete conversations about what else can we do. And so speaking about one of the current wins, I'm going to share one W that's in formation. So the building that we're organizing in now, was a product of the civil rights movement. Tenants organized with Martin Luther King, black folks organized with Martin Luther King and some local civil rights leaders to make sure that this parcel of land, these two parcels of land were developed for Black people to remain, because urban removal oftentimes meant, like James Baldwin said, Negro removal. And so they organized to fight to remain in that neighborhood. And so, of course, Shaw, if you guys know about anything about DC, Shaw's kind of like right in the middle, historically Black neighborhood. Capital came in and said, hey, it's time to speculate. And we want to make sure that Shaw becomes the new home for people who have tons of money to just drop into housing. So that meant most of the DC residents who were there, particularly Black residents, were oftentimes displaced if you were tenants. And so these tenants in this particular building, they were dealing with the landlord pushing them out without telling them why. And they got so tired of that dispossession when they were pushed to one other side of the property and the landlord tried to sell the rest of the property under their noses. They then used that contradiction to say, no, you're going to make sure that you develop this property the way that we intended. And so right now we've been organizing with them, and they've decided to make sure that that development is permanently affordable. That means in perpetuity, y'all. They're in the process now of selecting someone who they believe aligns with their values. So they press these developers to make sure that they actually built permanently affordable family-sized units, because y'all know in a lot of these urban spaces with gentrification, they do not care about family-sized units no more. So those 3-4 bedrooms, hard to effing find. So they were like, no, we're going to build 3 to 4 bedrooms. We're going to make sure tenants are included in the process. We're going to make sure tenants actually have veto power in different aspects of the decision-making. So that type of power sharing is a huge victory in a city where we're constantly saying, how can we have strong tenant rights, but then have the highest rates of gentrification happening in the country? This building is one example of how tenants use their lived experiences and said, no, we're going to use these contradictions and we're going to actually motivate us to think more broadly. And then I just want to lift up one last thing. There's also victories that that are historical, that we may have lost, but actually are very useful. So one thing about DC is that we actually had a victory of an anti-speculation tax. This is back when we had a majority Black city council with many on the board many on the council that had ties to the civil rights movement. That was a huge victory. Now, the landlords and capitalists came in and just shut that down. But that type of victory is really huge, because then that sets a precedent for other cities to then say, we should be putting taxes on activities that we don't want to see happen in the economy. It happened in Vermont. DC adopted it from Vermont. And so there are other places where we are constantly putting regulations on what happens in the real estate. And I think those are some of the victories that we can lift up again and probably apply in our own context.
Thanks. Amara, since there's a whole policy platform, I figured I'd let you jump into this question before we move forward.
Yeah, so I mean, there are so many, I think what we lifted up is it builds on things that are already in place across the country. And so when we talk about some of the things we mentioned, and the timing of the last thing in the chat is just on point, because I was going to lift up the work around cooperatives. We're not speaking in theoretical terms, right? So we can go to Boston, we can go down to Jackson, Mississippi, we can go to California and actually see the things that we are talking about in practice. And those are wins that we actually should be amplifying, because it creates the conditions to be replicated. And essentially, that's what we're trying to do, at least giving a line of sight to what the work could look like and what a win could look like, and then creating the conditions to replicate and to scale. And so that's really what we're leaning into. I encourage folks, we do have a whole vision for Black Lives Platform, and it has things like public banking. It has all of the solidarity economy components. It has, what does a tax, what are the things that we should be demanding around taxation? Should Black people be paying tax? There are questions that we ask that inform the policy platform. And so I just want to encourage folks to check out the Vision for Black Lives Policy Platform, but also to tap into some of these local examples of work that are happening and to ask questions. This is where communities of practice become valuable, because then we can learn from each other. What worked, what didn't, What landmines do we need to avoid? That's the kind of collective and collaborative work that we need to be leaning into.
Thanks. So I'll just ask, so this seems to be a popular question, so I'm going to ask it after a fashion and see. But the question is about how are your organizations factoring in climate change, which could have potentially major impacts in terms of migratory patterns. I mean, the questioner suggests that people will come from the American South into the northern areas. Certainly, that's not what's happening right now, but it could happen. But how do you think about climate as it affects prosperity, economic, and land equity for Black people? Anyone can jump into that.
I'll say it's not contemporary for us. It's more historical because we're, again, a regional funder. So we're just in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And it's more like the historical and environments that Black people were placed in, right? So I'm talking about Buzzer Point in DC. I'm talking about where Black communities are and like the bus depots in the city. Like we're thinking about that when it comes to repair. And it's more historical climate racism versus like contemporary.
Any other thoughts on this?
I mean, I'll just offer that the climate crisis is you don't have the climate crisis is tied to the system of capitalism, system of racial capitalism. So a lot of the interventions that we see around the climate crisis, for those who are paying attention, replicate. So when you talk about carbon markets, and these are the neoliberal strategies that are proffered really to just make palatable the status quo. And so when we talk about economic justice, that's directly a climate issue because without the system of capitalism and exploitation, both of the land and people, we don't have a climate crisis. And so we have to be thinking about that in our work. It is not some issue over there for people who love trees and the ocean. It is tied specifically to the ways that people are exploited, land is exploited and destroyed for the sake of profit, for the sake of profiteering that gives no regard to the long-term impacts on land and people. And that's essentially what the climate crisis is. So everything that we do when we talk about justice, we're either pushing back to create a world that is not in crisis, or we're listening to those who have created this current framework and are proffering so-called solutions that actually just make like shifting the chairs on the deck of the Titanic, right? So we have to be discerning and understand what neoliberal offerings are being proffered to address climate, and we have to see ourselves in our work as part of climate justice work.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to go to maybe a related question. This is not about climate, but it sort of touches on the theme you were just talking about, Amara. But, how do we develop and implement strategies to close the wealth gap, provide economic opportunity, and so on, in ways that don't perpetuate capitalist values or neoliberalism in ways that have, harmed our communities? So, any thoughts about that? I think this was kind of what Esteban Kelly was trying to get at in his question too. Sort of if you don't create the structures to capture the wealth in community, it can easily go in and leak out. So, how do you think about that?
Well, that's why I think that's my point around cooperative economics. Like what we know is white supremacy adapts, right? There have been moments in the times of Black prosperity in this country, and the system has corrected itself to strip us of that wealth. And so I think you have to be vigilant and diligent, but then also how are you in the places that you're like, if you're investing or you're trying to make impact, how are you making sure that the folks that that you're not perpetuating and causing more harm around gentrification, and like how do people get to stay in place? How do people that have been in these communities through the bad times get to stay when there are times of prosperity? And how do you intentionally keep the wealth in Black community, particularly when it comes to reparations, when we're talking about resources going to a specific group? What we know is that when some Black folks actually benefited from the GI Bill, and then white folks went and created night school industries to strip them of those benefits so that you can't go to college unless you get this GED. So come pay all your money and your resources to get this GED, and then you don't have those resources to get that college education, right? So we know that. So for me, it's just this goes back to anti-Blackness and white supremacy adapting. And you have to know that there will be predators there to get, and white supremacy will be the predator there to extract all the wealth they can. This will be an economic benefit for them too. So how do you control for that is the question I think that everybody should be asking.
Great. I'll try to get one more audience question in. We're running short on time, but the question is, are schools a good pillar for endorsing and supporting this work, and maybe how would be? I'll add to that. Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion about education, so I figured this would fit in.
Yeah, can I add to the just 1 minute on Timmy's point? So reparations has, I said, 4 pillars, right? So if we get comprehensive reparations, that component of restitution, restoring folks we didn't come here with those individualized, we came here with collective thought, right? So I mean, a lot of it is the medicine is in reparations, right? Deepening our relationship to what the elder in New Zealand said, re-indigenization, right? Is a core commitment to satisfying reparations. And so that will determine, and that will assist with, I think, the re-education of our folks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in order to keep resources in community. And also, how do we use resources gained to address to deepen our relationship with the continent, right? And then so I feel like there's a lot of knowing that will come through that pillar of restitution. I think oftentimes when we think about reparations, there's so much focus given to compensation that the other pillars of reparations just they fall to the wayside. But that pillar of restitution is my favorite, obviously. And so I'm always going to lift it up as okay, if we're talking about what do we do with the bag when we get it, this is the pillar that will help us and assist us with that. Yeah, we can get to the next question.
Okay, well, we have a couple of minutes left. Any quick responses about how to advance this work within schools?
I mean, I'll share that. I think for this question, and then I also want to address the climate change question a little bit. I think it still has to do with decision-making power and the kind of what Amara brought up earlier about that imagination and that kind of that premise, right? That you have power and that your power matters and should be acknowledged, right? And so we do participatory budgeting in schools and actually have young folks be able to be part of making the budget decisions that impact them within their school. And that actually creates a very different kind of adult, right? It creates a kind of adult that isn't looking for somebody to represent them. It creates a person who has a imagination of what real leadership looks like and has a different kind of vision of what even the role of government is, right? As a facilitator, as someone who actually just facilitates the decision making that the folks who are impacted make. And so I think that that's, a key thing is getting that in early, doing some of that visioning and imagination early, and having that space actually be a place where people have power. And then just slightly on the conversation around climate change. I want to share this article from my colleague Ingrid Haftel, co-published with an organization in Hawaii, about how participatory budgeting can be involved in our interventions around climate change. And so this article is about participatory budgeting and renewable energy. And so just to me, at least, the core of many of our interventions or conversations is about decision making, who decides, and making sure that we are rooting our intervention there before the decision and who is deciding.
Great, thanks. So I think we're going to make that the last word because we're at time. I want to, before we close though, thank all of our panelists. Amara Enyia from the Movement for Black Lives, Tammy Bennett from If a Foundation for Radical Possibility, Rosemary Ndubuizu from One DC, Rahel Teka from Participatory Budgeting Process, and Rich Wallace from Equity and Transformation in Chicago. Thanks to all of you for your contributions. Thanks to the amazing questions and chat. We will try to get some of the links out as you know when we send out the recording, which will happen by Monday. And yeah, hope to continue this conversation. So thanks again, everyone, for their contributions. And just to note, there will be another Remaking the Economy webinar on April 17th, so 4 weeks from today. And it's with Trevor Smith of the Bliss Collective, who's on this call, and we'll look at narrative change. And if you can complete the evaluation after you log off, please do that. That really does help inform our future webinars and work. So thanks again to all our panelists.